Social anthropologists make distinctions between societies whose members will accept curbs on their impulses because they are confident that injustices against them will be redressed by the legal system, and those societies where honor crimes flourish because of the absence of effective, uncorrupted law enforcement. In the latter societies, invariably patriarchal cultures where a woman's virtue bears the burden of the family's social fortune, immediate and disproportionate revenge is perceived to be necessary to restore social order. Honor culture has bloomed among such disparate groups as the Bedouin, the Arab Bedouin, Scottish, English herdsmen of the border country, and cowboys of the Wild West. So even though in the present day, in the West, about 95% of honor killings happen to be perpetrated by Muslims, throughout history, it is clear that honor-motivated violence against girls and women has less to do with one specific religion than with the role of dowries, inheritance, and the lack of a dependable legal system. Today, however, we must deal with the unpleasant reality that honor killing has virtually disappeared in the West. It remains a problem amongst Hindus, Sikhs, and even Christians in South Asia, but globally, the overwhelming number of honor-motivated crimes are a feature of Muslim countries, sometimes entrenched in law. Article 340 of Jordan's Criminal Code stipulates that, quote, a husband or close blood relative who kills a woman caught in a situation highly suspicious of adultery will be totally exempt from sentence. Not demonstrating adultery, note, but only highly suspicious. Pakistan is the epicenter of this phenomenon. In honor cultures, even a rumor can be an incentive to violence. Recently, a Punjabi father killed all 6 of his daughters because 2 of them were rumored to have been flirting with boys. The incident struck me with unusual force because it echoed an episode in the book Meryl mentioned that I worked on last year and collaborated with Aruna Pap, who grew up in the Punjab and who had witnessed many episodes that make this actually a validated kind of story. And she now works with South Asian families in honor-related crisis and helps to educate those who work with them, social workers and police, and she has become a dear friend. Her book is called Unworthy Creature, a Punjabi daughter's memoir of honor, shame, and love. It's called Unworthy Creature because that is what she was called growing up, and so were other girls. The eldest of 6 daughters, Aruna, is a third-generation Christian. She relates an illustrative tale of the power of rumor in an honor society. Her episode begins at a boarding school run by missionaries that she was attending in her early teens. She suffered an attack of appendicitis, and there were no facilities at the school to deal with it. But when the headmaster, a white missionary from Australia, brought her to Delhi, her father was appalled because he was sure that everyone would assume that was the only reason she'd been sent down was for some compromising sexual behavior. In that case, her reputation would be ruined, nobody would allow their son to marry her, and furthermore, none of her sisters would find husbands either. In his eyes, it would have been better for her to stay at school and die for lack of medical attention than to shame the family and compromise all the other girls' fortunes. And that was precisely the reason that the father in the news killed all his daughters, because once 2 of them were damaged goods, all of them were. When Aruna finally had her operation, the Western headmaster, who had been horrified by the father's indifference to his daughter's suffering, sarcastically offered the removed appendix to the father as proof that she had had a good reason to come home. But instead of being insulted, the father was extremely happy to accept the appendix and walked around with it in his pocket, flourishing it at people when they asked about his daughter's health as a way of deflecting rumors about her virtue. Westerners find it difficult to relate to such an attitude. We have been brought up as individuals with the expectation that we will choose our own path in life. To understand honor culture, one must think of oneself not as an individual, but as a role. You are a son or a daughter, a brother or a sister, a father or a mother, a father-in-law or a mother-in-law. Your role dictates your behavior and your obligations. When one steps out of the prescribed role to act as an individual, the smooth functioning of the family collective is threatened. Educating immigrants to accept their children, both boys and girls, as individuals and not as cogs in a cultural wheel is the first and most important step in breaking the cycle of honor-motivated violence against girls and women. And elaborating on this theme and others, I'm going to first call on Raheel Raza. Raheel Raza is a Muslim Canadian journalist, author, public speaker, media consultant, anti-racism activist, and interfaith discussion leader. She is the author of Their Jihad, Not My Jihad, A Muslim Canadian Woman Speaks Out. She opposes terrorism committed in the name of Islam. She also is an outspoken adversary of what she has called inequality towards Muslim women. As a result, she has received death threats. She observes, "I have been sued for calling extremists extremists. And I am listed on the world's 10 most hated Muslims list. I'm number 6. I hope to be number 1. Obviously, I'm doing something right. Raheel believes that an ideology of hate that has nothing to do nothing to do with Islam. She believes that parents are the first line of defense against imported hatred of Canadian values. Raheel founded an organization called Forum for Learning and is currently the president. She has been awarded the Constance Hamilton Award of the City of Toronto and the Canadian Ethnic Journalists and Writers Club Award for Excellence in Journalism. It's my pleasure to call Raheel to the podium.
Thank you, Barbara. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I grew up in Pakistan in a culture where women were supposed to be seen and not heard. And as you can obviously see, I want to be heard, but more importantly, I want to be seen in my Technicolor Dreamcoat here. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. One of the warning signs of fundamentalisms has been defined by the international organization WLUML, which is Women Living Under Muslim Laws, as anti-women policies, whether it's attacks on freedom of movement, the rights to education, a simple act of driving a car in Saudi Arabia, all this under authoritarian and theocratic regimes, and the imposition of unjust laws. All this is a struggle for women to get equal status and justice, which I've outlined in my book in a chapter called Gender Jihad. Fundamentalist patriarchy is a mixture of a system of economic exploitation and psychological disorder. According to my activist friend at Columbia, Dr. Carol Fontaine, she says it's a disease caused by the fear, stress, and cosmic loneliness of the elite male oppressor. Like any disease, she says, it can be treated, but we must fight fire with fire. To regard any person as property to be used and controlled is an insult to God, humanity, and to this earth. I believe that the Quran does not so much grant rights to women as it does affirm that women arrive in this world with full rights by nature of being alive. Let me explain that the discourse in the Quran on women is rights-based, but in Sharia, thanks to man-made laws based on concocted secondary literature, compounded by tribal and cultural practices passed off as faith, the entire discourse is duty-based for women and rights-based for men, something which one found during the period of the Jahiliyyah, or the ignorance, 1400 years ago. It was too hard for men to accept equal dignity for men and women in the tribal and feudal society within which Sharia rules were compiled. That is a revolutionary insight then and now. Friends, I have absolutely no doubt in my mind as a believer that God did not create women to be mistreated as second-class human beings in any faith, as many of you are aware in your own histories and as Barbara has so clearly outlined. So I'll utilize your valuable time here to point out how some men have misused and twisted concepts in Islam, fudging the fine line between culture and faith to legitimize their crimes against women. Let me first give you a quick 101 on Sharia. Sharia is a word that means the flowing path to water, so it reflects fluidity. In its most positive connotation, it's meant to be flexible and applicable to this day and age, dealing with current issues. The word Sharia is mentioned only 3 times in the Quran, where it means moral and ethical guidance. And the majority of observant Muslims implement the moral and ethical guidelines of Sharia in their life through fasting, diet, rituals of birth and death, prenuptial agreements at marriage, and all this is done without any side effects. Why? Because A, they're not forcing it in the public sphere, and B, they're not using it as a parallel legal system in a non-Muslim environment. Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Sudan are the only countries with a pretense to a completely Sharia-based legal system, and it has failed in the Sudan. Elsewhere, it's limited to certain regions, as in Nigeria. More importantly, for your information, Sharia itself states that it cannot be introduced in a non-Muslim country. The Prophet enjoined the immigrants or the muhajirs who went to Christian-ruled Ethiopia to obey the laws and customs of the country to which they immigrated. This cannot be and has never been challenged in Islam, except very recently by marginal figures. Unfortunately, these fringe groups or marginal figures have become a force to contend with. So with a silent majority of Muslims sitting on the fence, we have to fend for ourselves in this struggle. And I sometimes find myself caught between a rock and a hard place, something you Canadians described so beautifully, between the 2 extremes of the far right and the far left. The claim that some Muslims make that Sharia is divine has never been validated logically or theologically. Sharia was implemented as an Islamic system of law about 100 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. But even then, 1400 years ago, there were some aspects of Sharia that were very women-friendly, compassionate, tolerant, and ethical, and dealt with issues of that time in place. But over time, Sharia was frozen with no movement, no development, no research, no education, reasoning, or logic. And therefore, what happens to water when you leave it standing for a long time? It starts to stink and it becomes stagnant. And that is what has happened to the concept of Sharia. Today, it has become primarily man-made law, where women were not consulted in any of the lawmaking processes, therefore making it harsh and one-sided. And it's these man-made anti-women laws passed off as Sharia today that I want to challenge. Let me point out to you that this can't be done without the collaboration and support of our moderate Muslim brothers and friends, who I will mention later in the solutions. First of all, let's take a look at honor killings, and Barbara mentioned this, and we do call them honor killings. You're familiar with the case, I'm sure, of Aqsa Parvez, the teenager who was murdered in Mississauga, and the sisters Zainab, Sahar, and Geeti Shafi from St. Leonard, along with their aunt Rona Amir Muhammad, who were also victims of honor killings. This does not include thousands of women who are victims of honor killings in Jordan, Egypt, Pakistan, Syria, and other Muslim countries. According to a UN government report, 4,000 women were killed in Pakistan in the name of honor between 1998 and 2003. In a study of female deaths in Alexandria, Egypt, 47% of the women were killed by a relative after the woman had been raped. In Jordan and Lebanon, 70 to 75% of the perpetrators of these so-called honor killings are the women's brothers. And Barbara has already mentioned the shocker, the Article 340 of the Jordan Penal Code, which is not the only country that has a legal code that actually allows the perpetrators of these crimes to get away. It was about 3 years ago that the outgoing UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Louise Arbour, said, and I quote, "There can be no taboos in the Human Rights Council." Ironically, there were taboos then, and they're still there today. Last year, I was invited to the UNHCR to present a paper in Geneva at the Human Rights Commission to table honor killings as an international criminal offense. I was up against the Organization of Islamic Conference, almost entirely made up of Muslim men, and that was perhaps the most intimidating moment of my life, which is hard to do, by the way. I pointed out to the UN that while honor killing is not confined to Muslims, what is particularly shocking is that after murdering a sister or daughter, these criminals walk away free because of the Islamic law